Whips in Dungeons & Dragons suck. Look, I hate to say it, but except for very rare cases, there's no reason to use a whip in D&D unless you're doing it for flavor purposes or you're doing it for a very specific build. And even then, you should probably just use a polearm. But see, that's the problem. I'm playing a whip-wielding bard in the upcoming min-maxed RPG campaign with Sellsword Arts, Blumenek, Instructor Bensei, and Tater the Bard. Tater is the DM, he is not the bard. I'm the bard. I'm the bard because he made me play a bard. And since we're basically playing ourselves with our own weapon proficiencies, I am playing a bard who uses a whip. And like I said before, whips in Dungeons & Dragons are not good. They only do a D4 of damage, which is the worst damage in the game. It's this little guy, and it means that the most damage you can roll on an attack, before you add any modifiers or anything like that, is 4. And in a game where enemies can have hundreds of hit points, that is simply not optimal. Maybe you get, I don't know, a magical whip that adds fire damage, but I mean, that's just unrealistic. Fireball! On top of that, they're a martial weapon, which means you can't use them without specific training, and that means a lot of classes, like Bard, can't even use them well. And they're not a light weapon, which means you can't dual wield them unless you take a feat. Dual wielding of whips? Oh, no, not in my D&D campaign. But despite all these drawbacks, I am here as a professional circus performer with 30 years of whip cracking experience and 4 Guinness World Records related to whip cracking to tell you that whips are somehow even worse in real life. Let's go outside. I'll show you why. So we're outside now, and I brought along the kind of whip that I would want to use in combat. This is a 6-foot-long bullwhip, but it's important to remember 6 feet in whips is only measured from the butt of the handle to the end of the braid. You count this, you actually get another 2.5 feet, which brings the whole length of this whip up to about 9.5 feet. I would want to use this sort of whip because it's small enough, short enough, that I can still use it quickly and feel like I'm not leaving myself open with big swingy motions. I could go for an even smaller whip, something like this 3-foot performer's whip that I use in my show. But the problem with this one is, as you can hear, that sound is not as loud as it would be, which means the damage behind it isn't going to be quite as good. You could also use this longer, heavier whip, but the problem with that is, even though you're going to get more damage out of it, it's so long that it takes a long time to swing it around and be safe with it. Useful, but slow. Now, there is a lot that Dungeons & Dragons gets right about whips. First and foremost, they're a finesse weapon, which means you can use either strength or dexterity to crack the whip. And that's hugely important. You don't actually need to be that strong or put that much weight behind the whip to make it crack. I started cracking whips when I was 7 years old. I was not very strong back then, and I was able to make a whip crack consistently every single time then. That said, the more power you put behind a whip, the louder crack it's going to make, and the more damage it's going to do. And of course, more strength means you can handle bigger whips like this Chinese chain whip that I got just a couple of weeks ago. Or if you want to go really extreme, this Indonesian pet shoot that takes almost 2 hands for me to wield it properly. Oh. I felt the shockwave that in my face. But as you can see, the bigger the whip gets, the heavier the whip gets, the slower the whip moves, which means fewer attacks per round. So sure, you can use strength to wield your whip, but at the end of the day, it's also going to come down to dexterity, placing your cracks where you want them so that they'll do maximum damage and so that you don't whip yourself in the process. Because where you crack a whip makes a big difference in terms of how much damage it's going to do. For example, watch this. That did not hurt one bit. I'm a professional. Don't try that at home. Because you see, if you get the whip to crack below where your target is or ahead of your target, it's going to expend most of the energy. It's not actually going to do all that much damage. So when you're trying to maybe cut a soda can in half, you want to make sure that the whip is cracking right as it hits the target. The other thing that D&D gets right about whips is their range. Now, most weapons mean you have to be 5 feet away from your opponent to be able to hit them.
Whips, that's not the case. You actually get 10 feet of range, which is handy because, as I said, this 6-foot whip is actually about 9.5 feet long when you count the whole range. And of course, if I just move forward ever so slightly and stretch, I can really reach far with that whip. And if I want to just swing around like this, I create a whole space where it's very hard for someone to get in to my zone of control. Sentinel feet looking at you. But where whips stop being realistic in Dungeons and Dragons is with the damage. Because here's the thing, even though whips do basically the least amount of damage that you can do with a whip, they still do too much damage. Because the problem is, even though whips are loud and they sound scary, they don't actually do a whole lot when it comes to real, lasting damage. Take something as simple as, I don't know, cutting a can of seltzer in half with a whip. Now, I can cut a can of seltzer in half with a whip, but there are a lot of caveats involved with that trick. We're going to go through them in just a second, but first, let me show you what that trick looks like, nice and clean. That is a trick that took me 10 years to learn with a lot of trial and error, and it's still not a trick that I can get 100% of the time. There are a lot of things that can go wrong with that trick. Let's talk you through a few of them. Now first, I have to make sure that the whip is cracking right as it hits the can. If it cracks too early, well, then it doesn't do a whole lot other than kind of leaving a dent in the can. Here, I'll aim over there and you'll see what I mean. Little dent right there. Let's try it a couple more times. Sure, I hit it. It was loud. There's only a tiny dent right along that line. Right there. Let's show you one more. So sure, I got a little bit of a cut there, but it didn't go all the way through. The other issue that I run into is I have to make sure that I'm a very, very, very specific distance away from that can. If I'm too far, doesn't really do a whole lot. First and foremost, it might not reach it consistently. This is about a foot away from where I was before. Dent in the bottom of the can. Gross. And yeah, sure, I got a little bit of a cut out of it, but more than anything else, mostly just a dent. Look at the size of that hole. There's not a whole lot coming out of that. And finally, if I'm too close, I'm not going to be hitting the can with the part of the whip that's actually going to do anything. I'm going to be hitting it with the braid, and that's not going to do anything at all. Maybe give them a little bit of rope burn. I don't know. Let's give it a shot. It also makes it a lot harder to hit the can. I don't think there's even a dent this time. Here was the spot. Take a step closer. And it should be pointed out, this is about 5-foot distance. A little bit, not a whole lot. And in case you're wondering, Jack, why aren't you using the whip that you showed us before, this 6-foot whip? The reason I'm not using it is because I know that this whip is going to do absolutely nothing to a soda can. The other whip I have was made specifically for cutting cans. This whip was made for breaking Guinness World Records. Let me show you the difference. Is there even a dent? There's a slight dent right there. This whip ain't doing nothing against this. But Jack, you're saying, you still did damage to those? Certainly that counts. Well, let me show you what happens when we try a whip on something that's not quite as thin as an aluminum can. All right, we got our melon in our popcorn can. Let's see what this does. Going on proper technique. If this does anything more than leave a slight dent, I will be very surprised. And it's also worth pointing out, I have to set this technique up really carefully. And an enemy in combat is just not going to wait around for me to sit around and do that. Here's what we have. It made a mark, sure, but that's not a ton of damage. Let's try it again. Left another mark. All right, that was a good slash. But again, that's not much more. The sword's going to do a whole lot more than that. Let's try something with a slightly harder exterior. This time we got a cantaloupe. Can I whip it? I bet I can. Cantaloupe. Take one. I'm surprised it did that much. This is what we got. Let's try it again. Missed it. That left a little tiny mark, and more just dented it than anything else. So we've got the mark there, and then up there you can see where it kind of just dented it. Not a whole lot. Let's try something a little different. We got a pineapple. Yeah, that works. Did that do anything? Maybe the slightest of marks right there. I hit the top leaves that time, and it didn't even cut the leaves. All right, so we just whipped this thing like 10 times. And the most we did was a little tiny bit there. And I'm out of breath now, because I did a bunch of whipping. And I can hear all of you saying right now, but Jack, you still did damage. Certainly doing the least amount of damage is totally fine. No, it's still too much damage. Because here's the thing, you gotta understand, in Dungeons and Dragons, a commoner, a normal person, has 4 HP. And I'm playing a bard with 16 dexterity, which means any time that I hit with a whip, it means that I'm going to add 3 to my damage, which means even if I roll a 1 on the d4, I'm doing 4 damage. So no matter what, if I hit a regular person with my whip, I am going to kill them in Dungeons and Dragons. That is not realistic. Now sure, it might be realistic for, I don't know, other kinds of weapons. So let's go up literally 1 scale in damage up to the short sword. The short sword in Dungeons and Dragons does 1d6 worth of damage versus the 1d4, meaning a 6-sided die. Normal die you'd use in, like, say, if you're playing Monopoly. This sword, compared to the whip, looks like this trying to cut fruit. You see the difference? I've also not used a sword much in my life, and it was that easy. I gotta save this. I want to eat this later. It's good pineapple. Ooh, that's tasty. Also, I don't know how I'm gonna clean this sword afterwards. Yeah, we'll deal with that later. Hey, let's try the melon. Now I want to fruit ninja it up. Now, the cantaloupe. I was not even good. I was slicing it like that across, and it still was that easy. I should also point out, I'm pretty sure this sword is like 6 years old. I've never sharpened it. I haven't taken very good care of it. And like, look at that. That's you're telling me this is 1d4 of damage, and this is 2 more points of damage on average. They're not the same. Omae wa mou shinderu. That's right, I forgot. It's not very long range. Hang on, we'll try it again. Oh, but look, I made some modern art. Omae wa mou shinderu. Nani? Missing it almost completely did as much damage as like perfect technique with a whip. I'm gonna try and be real cool. If I get this, I'm the new sword YouTuber. I did it. Hey, David, Clark, how do I clean my sword after I get fruit all over it? So there you have it. Whips in Dungeons and Dragons, way more powerful than they are in real life. Swords in Dungeons and Dragons. Maybe, I don't know, maybe give them a boost. Stabby stab. Cheers.